When you spend a decade with someone, you start to notice the subtle things, the change in tone, the shift in routines, the look in their eyes when they're not really present. For me, it wasn't a bombshell discovery that something was wrong. It began as a whisper, a hint. My wife, Emily, and I had built a life together. Our modest home, weekend barbecues, even our quirky arguments over which Netflix show to binge. It was all part of what I thought was a solid foundation. Emily had always been ambitious, with a sharp mind for business and a way of lighting up rooms. Her charm was magnetic. She'd gone from an assistant to a powerhouse executive in just a few years. I was proud of her, until her ambition started to build a wall between us. Late nights at work became the norm. Business trips were no longer sprinkled throughout the year, but became a constant. And though she reassured me with kisses and whispered promises, something felt off. I shrugged off my unease, chalking it up to my insecurities. She's working so hard for us, I told myself. I should support her. So, I did. I stayed up late waiting for her texts, prepared her favorite meals when she came home exhausted, and even wrote her notes to remind her how much I believed in her. But even my love had its limits. The silence between us grew deafening, punctuated only by her occasional forced laughter at my jokes or the sound of her car pulling away. Then came the tipping point. An unfamiliar credit card bill arrived in the mail. Emily had a pristine habit of managing her finances, every expense accounted for, every receipt meticulously saved. So when I saw charges for luxury dinners and five-star hotel stays under a card I'd never heard of, I felt the first real crack. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence whispered louder than my denial. Who was she dining with? I wondered. The receipts weren't addressed to a client or colleague. They were vague, impersonal. When I confronted Emily, she brushed me off with a laugh that felt more like a shield. Oh, come on, David. It's just business. You wouldn't understand how these deals are closed. It's high-stakes negotiations. Don't worry about it. But I did. After Emily's dismissive explanation, I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the crack in my trust was no longer a hairline. It was a fissure I couldn't ignore. Days passed, each one more suffocating than the last. She went on another business trip, and I tried to bury myself in work. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to push it aside, the doubt gnawed at me. My mind spun with questions, each darker than the last. On the second night of her trip, I found myself pacing the living room like a restless ghost. The house felt too empty, the silence too loud. I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. That's when I remembered the credit card statement. It was still tucked away in the kitchen drawer, a physical reminder of my suspicions. I pulled it out and stared at the charges again. One stood out, a dinner for two at a high-end restaurant in the city she was supposedly visiting for work. My chest tightened. Business dinners weren't uncommon for her, but something about the timing and the location didn't sit right. I grabbed my phone and started searching the restaurant online, looking for some kind of clue, anything to validate or dismiss my fears. And then it happened. My phone buzzed, startling me out of my spiraling thoughts. It was a text from Emily. Long day. Meetings ran over. Grabbing a quick bite before bed. Love you. Her message seemed innocent enough, but I couldn't shake the unease that twisted in my gut. I typed back a quick reply. Miss you. Call me if you're not too tired. She didn't respond. Minutes turned into hours, and still, nothing. I tried to focus on the TV, but the screen blurred before my eyes. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. A loud chime jolted me awake sometime after midnight. For a moment, I thought it was Emily, but when I looked at my phone, it was an email notification. I almost ignored it, but the sender's name caught my attention. Verified Infidelity Services. Confused and groggy, I opened the email. It was spam, an ad for a private investigator. Normally, I delete such a thing without a second thought, but this time, I hesitated. My finger hovered over the delete button before sliding down to the link. Within minutes, I found myself on their website, reading about how they specialized in uncovering the truth behind suspicions. I couldn't believe I was considering this. Am I really that paranoid? I whispered aloud. But then I thought about the nights she'd come home late, her distracted glances at her phone, and that unfamiliar credit card. With trembling hands, I filled out the contact form and hit submit. I told myself it was just to rule out the possibility. If she was telling the truth, I'd apologize profusely and bury my shame. But if she wasn't, that night, as I stared at the ceiling, the first real seeds of vengeance began to take root. The private investigator called me the next morning. His name was Mark, a no-nonsense man with a gravelly voice that carried the weight of years spent digging into people's lives. "You're looking for peace of mind or proof?" he asked bluntly. "Proof," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "But if there's nothing to find, I'll take peace of mind." Mark chuckled. "That's what they all say. I'll need details, her schedule, habits, anything out of the ordinary." I told him about Emily's frequent trips, the late-night dinners, the credit card statement. The words spilled out like water from a dam I hadn't realized was about to burst. Mark listened without interruption, and when I finished, he simply said, "I'll be in touch." I hung up and sat there for a moment, my chest tight. What had I just done? Had I crossed a line? But then I thought of Emily's laugh that night, how effortlessly she'd dismissed my questions. My doubt hardened into resolve. If I was wrong, she'd never have to know. But if I was right... The first update came 2 days later. Emily was still on her trip, texting me the occasional "busy day" or "can't wait to be home." But Mark's findings told a different story. "She had dinner at La Maison Rouge 2 nights ago," Mark began, his voice matter-of-fact. "Not alone. She was with a man, mid-30s, sharp dresser. I got pictures." My stomach dropped. "Did they?" "They were discreet," he said, cutting me off. "But body language doesn't lie." Leaning in close, laughing, touching his arm. "I've seen it enough times to know what it means." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Who is he?" "Still working on that. No obvious signs of a relationship online. He's careful. Probably not his first time." I ended the call and stared at the photos Mark had sent to my phone. Emily, radiant and laughing, her hand lightly brushing against the man's sleeve as they shared a private joke. She looked happy, happier than she'd looked with me in months. Anger and betrayal flared in my chest, but beneath it was something worse, an aching sadness that threatened to consume me. I thought of our wedding day, her vows, the promises we made. How had we ended up here? When Emily returned home, I tried to act normal, but every time I looked at her, I saw the woman in the photos. The distance between us felt insurmountable. She must have sensed it because one evening, as we sat in silence over dinner, she reached across the table and took my hand. "David, are you okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed in concern. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired from work." She didn't press further, but her gaze lingered, as if she knew there was more I wasn't saying. Little did she know, the game had only just begun. And this time, I wasn't playing to lose. Over the next week, Emily seemed to notice the shift in our dynamic. My once effortless smiles were replaced with guarded expressions, my casual affection with careful restraint. She began to tiptoe around me, testing the waters with small gestures, bringing me coffee unprompted, slipping her arms around my waist when I was doing dishes. But every touch, every gesture, felt rehearsed. My skin prickled under her hands, the warmth of her affection now tainted by the lies I knew lay beneath. Meanwhile, Mark's investigation continued. The man in the photos was identified, Jason Adler, a senior executive at her company. Single, attractive, and, according to Mark, notorious for his discreet liaisons with married women. "They've met up at least 3 times this month," Mark reported during one of our calls. "Lunches, late-night drinks, and what looked like a weekend getaway last month. She's careful, but not careful enough." I clenched the phone tightly. "Have you seen them cross a line?" "Not yet," he admitted. "But it's only a matter of time. People like him don't invest this much effort for nothing." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. It was confirmation of what I already knew but hadn't been ready to accept. Emily wasn't just pulling away from me. She was building a life with someone else, brick by deceitful brick. I decided it was time to stop being passive. If she thought she could rewrite the rules of our marriage without my consent, she was about to find out how wrong she was. That evening, I prepared dinner like normal, setting the table and pouring 2 glasses of wine. Emily came home late, her face flushed from the cold and her smile too bright to be genuine. "Sorry, meetings ran over again," she said, hanging her coat and sliding into her seat. "No problem," I replied casually, swirling the wine in my glass. "You must be exhausted. All those late nights must be tough." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Yeah, it's been a lot, but it's worth it. Big client. Could really help my career." I nodded, pretending to be impressed. "You're incredible, you know that? All this hard work. I don't know how you do it." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, I thought I saw guilt flash across her face. "Thanks, David. That means a lot." But then her phone buzzed on the counter, and she stiffened. "Work?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Probably," she said quickly, snatching the phone before I could see the screen. "I'll check it later." I nodded, taking a slow sip of wine to mask the fire raging inside me. She was hiding something. Of course, she was. The rest of the evening passed in strained silence, but my mind was racing. Emily thought she could keep her secrets, but she didn't realize I'd already uncovered most of them. She thought she was in control. She was wrong. The mask she wore was beginning to slip, and soon, I'd be ready to tear it off completely. The following days were a delicate dance. Emily continued to act as if nothing had changed, throwing herself into her routine with rehearsed enthusiasm. She played the role of the loving wife, asking about my day, laughing at my jokes, even suggesting we plan a weekend getaway to reconnect. "Just us, no work calls, no distractions," she said over dinner one night, her tone almost pleading. It might have been convincing if I hadn't already seen the photos. If I hadn't heard Mark's updates about her secret lunches with Jason Adler. Her suggestion wasn't about saving our marriage. It was a tactic, a way to placate me, to keep me from looking too closely at the cracks in our life. I smiled at her, pretending to consider it. "That sounds perfect," I said. "Maybe next month, after things calm down at work?" Her relief was palpable, and I hated how much satisfaction it brought me. She thought she was buying herself time, but all she was doing was giving me more space to finalize my plan. Mark's next report gave me exactly what I needed. "They're meeting at the Bellevue Hotel this Friday night," he said. "It's a private dinner in one of the suites. I've confirmed the reservation. Jason's name is on it. Romantic package, champagne included." The words hit me like a hammer. It was no longer just suspicion or speculation. This was it, the proof I needed to confront her. Yet, instead of anger, a cold clarity settled over me. This wasn't just about confronting Emily or Jason. It was about leveling the playing field. "What do you want me to do?" Mark asked. "Send me everything you've got," I replied. "Photos, timestamps, anything that proves where they'll be and when. I'll take it from there." That night, as Emily sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I watched her from the kitchen. She looked calm, content even, as if she'd mastered the art of juggling 2 lives. But her composure only fueled my determination. The next morning, I made my move. I withdrew a substantial amount of money from our joint savings account, careful to leave enough to avoid suspicion. Then I met with a lawyer I'd quietly hired a few weeks earlier. Together, we drafted papers outlining everything: her infidelity, the financial repercussions, and the terms of our impending divorce. I wanted it airtight, leaving no room for negotiation or manipulation. That evening, Emily kissed me goodbye before heading out for dinner with the girls. I smiled, watching her walk out the door, my heart pounding with anticipation. Once she was gone, I grabbed my coat and followed. The Bellevue Hotel wasn't far, and I arrived just in time to see her stepping out of a cab, dressed to kill. Jason was waiting for her at the entrance, his hand brushing hers as they disappeared inside. I stayed in my car, watching the lights in the suite flicker on. My phone buzzed with Mark's final update, confirming everything. The stage was set. Now, it was my turn to act. I parked across the street from the Bellevue Hotel, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I stared up at the glowing window of their suite. The evidence was undeniable now. Emily wasn't the woman I thought she was, and whatever trust we once had was beyond repair. But this wasn't just about confronting her betrayal. It was about reclaiming my power, about showing her, and Jason, that I wasn't a fool to be toyed with. I reached into the passenger seat and grabbed the manila folder containing Mark's evidence. Photos of their dinners, timestamps from her secret getaways, receipts for their romantic evenings, all of it meticulously documented. As I flipped through the pages one last time, my resolve hardened. The plan was simple. I wasn't going to create a scene or resort to shouting matches. Instead, I was going to let the weight of her lies crush her, to watch her squirm under the undeniable truth. I slipped the folder into my bag, stepped out of the car, and crossed the street toward the hotel. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne. I approached the concierge desk, feigning confidence. "Good evening," I said, sliding a crisp bill across the counter. "I'm here to deliver something to Mr. Jason Adler in Suite 214. Would you mind letting me up?" The concierge hesitated, eyeing me curiously before nodding. "Of course, sir." He handed me a key card, and I forced a polite smile. The elevator ride felt interminable, the ding of each passing floor echoing in my ears like a countdown. By the time I reached the second floor, my heart was pounding, but my mind was clear. I found their door easily enough, the faint hum of laughter filtering through the heavy wood. For a moment, I stood there, listening to their muffled voices. Emily's laugh drifted out, light and carefree, and for a second, I almost faltered. Was I ready for this? But then I remembered the photos, the lies, and the distance that had been growing between us for months. The hesitation evaporated. I raised my hand and knocked. The voices inside stopped abruptly. I heard shuffling, followed by Emily's familiar footsteps. When the door opened, her face froze in an expression of pure shock. "David," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Surprise," I said coolly, stepping past her into the suite. Jason was standing near the table, a bottle of champagne in one hand and a glass in the other. He looked at me, startled but quickly masking it with a smug smirk. "And you must be Jason," I said, my voice dripping with contempt. Emily tried to speak, but I silenced her with a raised hand. "Save it. I'm not here for your excuses." I dropped the folder onto the table, its contents spilling out like the damning evidence it was. Jason's smirk faltered as he scanned the photos, and Emily's face went pale. "This is who you are now?" I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You threw away everything for this?" The silence was deafening, broken only by Emily's shaky breath. "This isn't over," I said, turning toward the door. "Not by a long shot." And with that, I left, leaving them to their ruin. The real fallout was just beginning. The drive home was a blur. My hands trembled as they gripped the steering wheel, my mind replaying the scene in the hotel suite over and over. The look on Emily's face, shock, guilt, and something else I couldn't place, was etched into my memory. And Jason? His smug smirk dissolved so quickly once he saw the evidence. It was a small victory, but the weight in my chest didn't ease. When I pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before me, eerily silent. I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to steady my breath. The confrontation at the hotel had been cathartic in its own way, but it was only the beginning. The wheels I'd set in motion couldn't be stopped now. Inside, the house felt colder than usual. I headed straight to the office and pulled out the divorce papers I'd prepared earlier. They were thorough, crafted with precision to ensure Emily couldn't manipulate her way into a better deal. Every asset, every account, every potential liability, it was all accounted for. I sat at my desk, staring at the papers. My pen hovered over the page as I rehearsed what I'd say to her when the time came. There was no going back from this. Emily didn't come home that night. I wasn't surprised, but it still stung. Part of me hoped she'd at least try to explain herself, even if her excuses would have been meaningless. But her silence spoke volumes. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was a text from Emily. "David, we need to talk. Please." I ignored it. Instead, I made a call to my lawyer, explaining the events of the previous night and confirming that I wanted to move forward with filing. He assured me everything was ready, and we scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon. As I hung up, another text came through. "I'm coming home tonight. Please don't shut me out." A bitter laugh escaped me. Now she wants to talk? I thought. Where was this urgency when she was sneaking around behind my back? That evening, true to her word, Emily came home. I heard her car pull into the driveway, and moments later, the front door opened. I was in the living room, pretending to read, but my focus was on her every move. She entered hesitantly, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with red. She looked like she hadn't slept, her usual polished demeanor replaced by vulnerability. "David," she began softly, her voice trembling. "Don't," I said, cutting her off. "Just don't." She flinched, but I didn't care. I stood up, holding the divorce papers in my hand. "You made your choice, Emily, and now I'm making mine." Her eyes widened as I handed her the stack of papers. For the first time, her composure cracked and tears streamed down her face. "David, please, let me explain," she begged. But her words were too late. The damage was done. "This is the end, Emily," I said firmly. "You'll hear from my lawyer." I turned and walked away, her sobs echoing behind me. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. The days that followed were a whirlwind of paperwork and emotional detachment. My lawyer worked swiftly, ensuring the divorce filing was airtight. Every time I reread the documents, I felt a mixture of anger and liberation. Emily hadn't yet responded officially, though she sent me a barrage of texts and emails. Each message varied, some begging for forgiveness, others laced with anger at my rashness. I ignored them all. One night, as I sat in the quiet of the house that now felt less like a home, my phone buzzed again. Expecting another desperate plea, I almost didn't look, but the name on the screen stopped me cold. It wasn't Emily. It was Jason Adler. For a moment, I stared at his name, my heart pounding. Then I answered, my voice steady. "Jason," I said, keeping my tone even. "This is unexpected." "I'm calling to talk like adults," he replied, his voice measured but with an edge of irritation. "Talk," I said simply, leaning back in my chair. "What you did, showing up at the hotel like that, was unnecessary," he began. "This situation is between you and Emily. I don't appreciate being dragged into it." I laughed coldly. "You weren't dragged into it, Jason. You dove headfirst. You and Emily made this my business the moment you decided to turn my marriage into a joke." He hesitated, but then his voice turned smug. "Look, I get it. You're upset. But this doesn't have to be messy. If you're thinking of using this against her in court, know that it won't hold up. Affairs rarely do." I felt a surge of anger but forced myself to remain calm. "Oh, I'm not worried about the courts, Jason. I've got what I need to protect myself financially. But you're a different story." "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his confidence faltering. I leaned forward, gripping the phone tightly. "It means you might want to think twice about making enemies, Jason. Your reputation, your career, those are fragile things, aren't they? It'd be a shame if someone sent a certain folder of photos and videos to the right people." There was a long pause on the line, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "You're bluffing." "Try me," I said, my tone icy. Jason muttered a string of curses before ending the call abruptly. I set the phone down, satisfaction coursing through me. Let him squirm. The next morning, Emily showed up unannounced. She stood on the doorstep, clutching a file of papers. Her face was drawn, her hair disheveled. "David, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice breaking. I let her in but didn't offer her a seat. She handed me the papers, her response to the divorce filing. "I'm not fighting you," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. I glanced at the papers briefly before looking at her. "Good," I said, my voice devoid of sympathy. "David, please. I never meant—" "Stop," I interrupted. "You've said enough. Now let's finish this." Her tears fell freely, but I stood unmoved. There was no room for reconciliation. This was the reckoning she brought on herself, and I was done waiting for her to take responsibility. Emily continued to text and call, desperate for some semblance of control in the chaos she'd created. One morning, she showed up again, this time with a new strategy, bargaining. "I'll sign whatever you want," she said, her hands trembling as she sat across from me at the dining table. Just don't let this get out. Jason's already backing off. I can't afford to lose everything. I stared at her, emotionless. You didn't care about losing everything when you made those choices, Emily. Why should I care now? Her eyes brimmed with tears, but I wasn't moved. I'll give you the house. I'll walk away with nothing if that's what it takes, she pleaded. Her desperation was palpable, and it was tempting to take the offer. But this wasn't about the house or the money. It was about justice. Emily, I said calmly, this isn't just about the settlement. You betrayed me. You broke every promise we made. This is about facing the consequences of your actions. Her face crumpled, but she nodded, knowing she had no ground to stand on. A few days later, Mark sent me an update about Jason. Word of his affair with Emily had started to spread within their company, thanks to a leaked copy of the photos Mark had gathered. I didn't explicitly send them, just a few whispers in the right ears. Jason was called into a meeting with the board and placed on indefinite leave to investigate potential misconduct. His polished reputation, his untouchable aura, it was all crumbling. When Emily found out, she called me in a panic. You did this, didn't you? She accused. Me? I replied innocently. Jason's actions did this. Don't shift blame again. She screamed in frustration before hanging up. I smiled for the first time in days. The finalization of the divorce came quickly. Emily didn't contest anything, though she attempted to plead for leniency during mediation. I made a mistake, David, she said, her voice shaking. But I still love you. I always have. I couldn't hold back the bitter laugh that escaped me. Love? Emily, you don't know what love is. Love doesn't lie, cheat, or destroy. She looked away, defeated. The mediator handed her the papers, and she signed them without further argument. I walked out of that room with a weight lifted. I wasn't free yet, but the chains were loosening. Emily underestimated how quickly word of her affair would spread. Our community, small and tight-knit, began to treat her differently. Friends who once adored her suddenly didn't return her calls. Invitations dried up, and even her family looked at her with disappointment. She approached me one evening, her pride barely intact. Did you tell them? She asked. No, I replied honestly. You told them through your actions. People notice more than you think, Emily. With the divorce finalized, I began the slow process of rebuilding my life. I sold the house, too many memories, and moved to a smaller, more peaceful place. Therapy helped me unpack the emotional scars, though trust was still a distant goal. Emily tried to contact me several times, but I blocked her number. She was part of my past now, and I refused to let her poison my future. Jason's career was over. Rumors swirled about other affairs, and his name became synonymous with scandal. Last I heard, he was struggling to find work outside of the city. It wasn't revenge, it was karma. Emily, too, was struggling. She'd been demoted at work, her reputation in shambles. I felt no joy in their suffering, only closure. They had reaped what they'd sown. Months turned into a year, and I finally began to feel whole again. I joined a community group, reconnected with old friends, and even started dating cautiously. The wounds Emily left hadn't fully healed, but they were scars now, not open cuts. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you find happiness again. It was from Emily. I stared at the words, feeling nothing. I deleted the message and turned my phone off. The sun dipped below the horizon, and I smiled. For the first time in years, I felt free.